Have you heard about the need to cut CO2 emissions? Have you heard that the United Nations wants the United States to cut its CO2 emissions 80% below 1990 levels by 2050? What does this really mean? In 2004, the United States emitted 5,905 million metric tons of CO2, or 20.2 tons per person. Cutting our emissions by 80% below 1990 levels requires lowering them to 1,000 million metric tons, or 2.4 tons per person in 2050. Cutting CO2 emissions by 80% would lower our emissions to approximately the same level they were during World War I, during Woodrow Wilson's presidency. Most of our CO2 emissions are the result of using energy. 39% come from generating electricity, 20% from using gasoline, and much of the rest from natural gas usage to heat our homes and offices and for use by industry. If we are to cut our overall CO2 emissions by 80%, we must significantly cut the CO2 emissions caused by generating electricity and from driving our cars. But is this possible? Coal is used to generate 50% of our electricity and produces 82% of CO2 emissions from generating electricity. Natural gas is used to generate 21% of our electricity and produces 13% of CO2 emissions from the generation of electricity. Coal and natural gas together produce 95% of the CO2 emissions from the generation of electricity. Nuclear power that generates 20% of our electricity produces 0 CO2 emissions. It would require 350 new nuclear power plants to cut CO2 emissions from the generation of electricity by 80%. 250 to replace all the coal-fired power plants, and the remainder to accommodate economic growth and replace existing nuclear power plants that can't obtain a second extension to their operating license. If we can't build this many new nuclear power plants, it will be necessary to stop generating electricity using coal or natural gas, unless sequestration is viable. Today, there is little probability that CO2 in these quantities can be safely sequestered. Wind, solar, and geothermal do not have sufficient scale to produce enough electricity to replace coal. Our earlier YouTube presentation on wind energy explained why. Cutting our supply of electricity will threaten our economy. The situation with gasoline is even starker. There are no substitutes for gasoline or diesel oil to power our cars while cutting CO2 emissions 80%. Biofuels can't do it. Natural gas would only cut CO2 emissions by 30% if all our cars were powered by natural gas. Without nuclear power for generating electricity, plug-in electric vehicles can only cut CO2 emissions by 18%. Gasoline rationing is inevitable, and this will also threaten our economy. Congress is considering cap-and-trade legislation that would require the United States to cut CO2 emissions by 80%. The EPA is about to issue regulations requiring the United States to cut CO2 emissions. While not setting a specific target, it references the United Nations CO2 stabilization program calling for an 80% cut. The book Carbon Folly explains in greater detail the proposed Senate legislation and the issues surrounding sequestration, cap-and-trade, conservation, and related energy issues. The website www.carbonfolly.com has information about this book. Any politician or reporter who says that CO2 emissions can be easily cut without hurting our economy is either distorting the facts or uninformed. For more information on energy issues, please see our earlier energy clarity videos at YouTube. We hope you have found this information useful. Watch for our next presentation that will be on natural gas. Can natural gas replace gasoline? This presentation has been produced by T.S. August. Additional information is available at www.tsaugust.org. Thank you for listening.